Hey, I'm Grant. Welcome to Second Plate, a cooking show that focuses on reusing ingredients and bringing in staples that you already have on hand for the recipes. So today I'm going to be making egg noodles and prepping them for a later show. Noodles are something that I've had on my list of goals for this show because it's something that you can very easily just buy in a store and you can make do. But there's a whole depth to what you can do with them, how you personally want to shape them, and just you can really tell the difference between when you made them and they have a lot more richness compared to, say, something store-bought. So we're going to go through and we're going to mix it all by hand, do it right here, form it up, knead it, and we're going to prep it for our next recipe, beef stroganoff. It's a lot easier than it looks, and it's pretty cool to watch it happen for the first time, but it's not nearly as hard as you would expect. So the main thing we're going to start with is just some simple flour. I'm going to be making a small little volcano in the center of my sheet here. Really, this is something where this entire recipe is just going to be judged by eye. I don't really have any set measurements for most of this, and that's something that I really have been trying to do a lot on the show. Is I like recipes that once you've done them once, you just know them forever, because it's just really more about understanding a simple concept than it is, say, with baking. Looks like I'm going to add a little bit more. Where, say, if you have a cake recipe or certain kinds of bread, you really need to know the exact measurements every single time. But with this, if we get all the way through and we see that, oh man, I need more flour or I have too much around, I'll basically be able to just adjust it on the fly, and that's kind of the goal here. So I'll probably have, this is probably more flour than I need, but this gives you the nice little dough in. Honestly, this is like one of the most fun parts of doing these noodle recipes is you get to do the little volcano and you actually work the dough. It's honestly pretty cool to me. I just love the idea of it. So I have 2 eggs. These are just normal, simple eggs. I'm going to crack them in the center here, hence why I'm forming this bowl. You could easily probably do this in just a mixing bowl, but the reason that I like doing it in here is it just makes adding the flour very easy, because you want to keep introducing a little bit more flour and a little bit more flour, but in very small amounts. And it's just a pain where if you could do it in the bowl, you have to constantly get a pinch, put it in, keep whisking it, get a pinch, put it in, keep whisking it, and that gets just a little bit annoying. So I have some olive oil here. I'm just going to put a little bit of a drizzle on. This makes it to be noodly. That's something that's already separating it from if I were to make just bread flour. Crack some salt. And then we are just going to start by making the dough. So I just have a fork. You could use pretty much whatever you want to whisk eggs, but I like this because even though I could use a whisk, it's small, it's on hand, it's very easy. I like to just start by popping my yolks, and I'm going to slowly just kind of beat these. And the goal is, whether intentionally or not, I'm slowly going to add flour to the mixture, just very slowly. And when I first did this, you get the impression that, oh, it's going to break out the wall and go all over your counter, but really, it's pretty good at staying in. Just kind of keep scraping the sides as I go. The only thing I would say to watch out for that I have done a couple times practicing this is I'll have to go, say, answer my phone or just do something while I'm making this, and I'll just set down the fork or knife or whatever I'm using, and that will destroy it, and your little egg mixture can run out, but for the most part, it's just really nice. Again, I've always used 2 eggs, but really, I'd say that's the only part you probably need to worry about scaling is how many eggs you use, because it's really easy where if I need more flour, I just add it. If I decide I don't want all of it, I just don't scoop it in. But the eggs are kind of the first thing that really determines the size of your recipe, the volume. Okay, keep scooping this in. Again, I am making dough, so if you ever made, say, bread, I'm basically going for the same kind of look and feel. We're even going to have to knead this afterwards. So it's a pretty manual little process, and I'll be honest, the more times I do this, it gets better, but it will tire out your arms pretty badly. So start to kind of thicken up, but it's still sticking, so we know it's not ready. Keep going. What I'm looking for is when it gets to a point where it's got enough flour that it sticks entirely, I'm going to instead switch away from the fork. Looks like it's almost there. And I have just a bench scraper. I just recently learned out that's what this is called, but this thing is an underrated, I'm hesitant to call it a gadget, but it's just so useful, just being able to like scrape things off on a flat surface. Like just working, just with flour alone, being able to like just scrape it off like there. It's huge for, say, cleaning. It's just awesome for anything you do with a pan. I heavily recommend it. You can get them super cheap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this into itself. I'm not yet kneading, but the reason I can't go with the fork anymore is because it's too sticky. I can't get it off the pan, but I don't quite want to just grab it with my hands yet either because that's going to be way too messy. So it's going to look like I have a bunch of excess flour here until it absorbs it, but I'm just kind of folding it in on itself. And it's okay if some of the dough separates because it'll take the flour at different rates. That's something I've learned from making bread a lot, is how your recipe takes its flour. And that's kind of dependent on like what kind of flour you have. This is just your general purpose flour. You could use bread flour if you want something a little bit, probably higher quality, but it's up to you, whatever you happen to have on hand. You can see it's starting to make an actual dough. This might be a little hard to see, and honestly, I have no perfect way to tell, but you'll start getting these little lumps where they are fully forming. Once we do that, that's when I want to kind of get in with my hands. So I'm just going to go smash this down, look for basically some wetness, and keep folding. And this is where I see how much flour I'm going to need. We're always probably going to need more, so this little pile over here, it's not wasted. And if you really needed to, you could even probably put that back with the rest. You just might want to sift through it, run it through like a little mesh so you don't get a chunk of your egg noodle in there. But that's just part of the recipe. I think really what this would be great for is if you made this alongside something else. Like since it's noodles, I'd say maybe some kind of bread to be served with the other dish would be ideal. And that would be a good use for the flour. All right, looks like we almost got this. So what I'm going to do is, this is just a small note that I learned working in the kitchen. You always end up with just a ton of flour. So I just go over to my trash can, rub, comes right off. It's just one of those little details where, I don't know, it's not too hard to figure out, but it's nice to mention that because, there's always a person I'm sure that didn't think of that. So I have my dough right here, and I'm going to begin to knead it. Cool. Let's get all these little sections off. Clear it some, dust it a little bit, dust my hands, and then just go to town. And I've kneaded on this dough, this show before. There's no exact process. Generally what I do to start is I'm just going to flatten it. I just hold my hands like this. I know some people will instead do the heel, but really there's no easy way to say this is just how you do it. You just have to try, just keep trying things, because really the only thing you need to have happen is you just need the dough to be agitated. You're just mixing it. So there's really no wrong way, and it's just whatever your personal tempo is what will work. Then also, as I add more flour, I'm folding it into itself. That's how I get it to work. And you should start seeing these flaky bits form up, and basically the dough should start pulling into itself as it becomes more of actual dough. And it just kind of happens all at once in my experience. Again, that goes back to the absorption rate of liquid for the flour, I believe is what it's called. And it's basically how quickly the flour can take water or liquids, or vice versa, how quickly the dough can kind of absorb it in. That's why you can't just say mix all the flour at once. You just got to knead it. It will continue to be sticky, add a little bit more. I don't know if it matters, but I do try to find where it's getting sticky and apply it straight there. So if I have a wet spot, Just go right there. It's not a big deal if you over flour it, and you can kind of tell as it's going when it'll be done, but it's something where, again, I'm sure this looks like I must be some master, know all this stuff, but really, I think it's pretty simple the first time you do this. Then you're like, okay, I kind of get it. And there's a wide variance of how much you can put of each ingredient. So ideally, this takes about maybe 5 to 10 minutes of kneading. Really, the only way to tell is once you get there at the end, because I know I've seen recipes where they say knead for 5 minutes, but I end up kneading for, say, 10 to 20 because I am just an amateur cook. I don't do this all day, so I'm not a, like say, a baker who has a ton of skill, and I'm sure they have a very powerful 5 minutes of kneading where they're just knead. It's like, no, I'll be honest, I take breaks or just a little like, okay, what do I need to put in? So don't feel bad if you have to go a little bit longer. Like, I think I looked it up, and just from other people saying their own experiences, that it is possible to over knead the dough, but you need to like drastically do it. Like, I want to say, like, if you're supposed to knead for 5 to 10 minutes, to over knead it, you need to knead for, say, like 40. Again, depending on just what your process is. And to be honest, I have generally a good strategy of how I go about this, but when I'm just cooking in my own kitchen, since the point is to just agitate it, I will just throw it around, I'll just slam it on the table, I'll punch it, just anything to be satisfying, because you're basically just doing this for 5 to 10 minutes. So, and anything that makes up the dough will work. Okay, as I get a little bit tighter, I try to specifically pull the dough apart a little bit. So instead of going down and getting it to splay out, what I like to do is I like to put, again, my fist like right here and kind of stretch it where I'm putting my weight out instead of down, and it just kind of presses it out and rolls. And then I just keep doing that. Particularly, I'll fold it in half and then try to press this in and out, and that seems to work pretty well. I have learned that this recipe and all bread recipes will really get you pretty well acquainted with your kitchen. So like in doing this recipe, and I was kneading in my house a bunch, I never noticed that my counters are like a little bit too high where you can't get a good leverage, because you want to be get up and over the dough. My counters are like right up here, and you're just doing this instead. And after 10 minutes, you really start to notice that. So again, it's looking like it's going to be pretty good. Again, it's pulling together. Like, you still have these little pieces that aren't fully mixed in yet. And you can even see it's still a little wet there, so maybe a little bit more flour. But for the most part, as it becomes less and less sticky, that means we're pretty good on the kneading. So we're honestly probably approaching where we need to be. Cool. So I'm just going to tidy up my space again with my really handy scraper. I cannot recommend this scraper enough. I'm going to redust this just slightly, and now I'm going to switch to a rolling pin, because what I want to do is I want to get this as flat and as wide as possible, because that's the kind of noodle I'm going for. I'm going for a long, wide, kind of stocky noodle. I personally do not have a noodle machine, but if you have that, it will make this a lot easier, because you can just get it down really flat, and then you feed it through that, and you don't have to cut your own noodles. Plus, they just look way better. However, I found with this one specific recipe, like in the next show, I'm going to be working on a beef stroganoff recipe, which basically makes its own sauce as you cook it. And I've noticed for that, I actually like really thick noodles, because I want them to kind of absorb that sauce. So that's what I'm going to be making, is fairly thick noodles. Plus, it's something where if you want to, say, make more of a spaghetti noodle with this, you can, but I can't say I would recommend using your time for that, because you're going to have to cut them each by hand. So just going through, trying to get this nice and square. No real technique to rolling pins. I personally, I'd never use the sides on my rolling pin. I just like to get in there and you can feel it, so I can do stuff like this, or like you can just work one side. I can tell this particular piece of dough is a lot thicker. I can really feel it, and I don't think that comes across on camera, how much it wants to pull into itself. So generally when that happens, I'm just going to keep going over one spot, really stretch it out. Because I feel like it's very easy to, say, just keep going back and forth over the whole thing, but you're not actually flattening it, because every time you get it like 10% wider, it contracts enough to completely undo that. So I'm just really gonna apply some weight. And if it's sticking to your rolling pin, just add a little more flour. That's something where, it's why I can't really recommend any specific type, because I've always had happen a lot for me, where it sticks to the rolling pin. But now, because of how it's absorbing the flour, it's like, oh, it's instead very tough, but I don't have to worry about that, and that's nice. Okay. Cool. So this is going to be good enough. I'm actually probably going to roll it out a little bit more once we have our actual noodles. So generally, I'm going for fairly thick noodles, so I'm going to cut them like so. But for the recipe I'm going for, and honestly most of the recipes I've used these for, you don't really need a certain noodle type. It's just more about having them in there for flavor. So I'm just going to go and cut this as best I can into a square, just so you have a nice clean canvas to work with. Again, I just like cut by basically slicing a little bit. I go down and I just kind of wiggle the knife back and forth. This is where you can tell if your dough's particularly sticky. It'll stick to the blade, but ours looks fine on that front. This is actually probably the closest to square I've ever gotten it. Usually it's some weird like H shape. Okay, and I'm just going to go down and cut these. There's nothing really particularly special about this shape or what I'm going to use it in, but I feel like these are just nice, aesthetic. If you really wanted to, you could keep doing like fancy things. I know you can actually freeze this dough or section it off, so if you like your noodles, I would totally recommend doing that, like say quarter it, and then just like squeeze as much water out as you can, throw it in the freezer. It can last a good amount of time. Plus, you can make them ahead of time then and just pull them out and cut them when you need your recipe. I really do like the thick noodles. I think that's something that I just can't stress enough, that I thought it was just me being kind of lazy by getting them into these like thicker strips. But in reality, I was really surprised how much I liked being able to bite into a thick, juicy noodle. Like this was the kind of thing where the reason I wanted to do noodles is I always thought noodles were kind of boring. Like I'm actually not a huge fan of spaghetti, just because I always thought like the noodles are just there to serve the sauce. But with noodles like this, and I'm sure if I actually made homemade spaghetti noodles, it feels like it's more than the sum of its parts. It's not just a way to, again, serve the sauce. And that was honestly pretty eye-opening, because it's like, oh, I get it so much more. Whereas if I use store-bought, I'm sure it would be fine, but it wouldn't be anything special. So luckily, these are pretty well floured already. This would be a stage where you'd want to make sure you kind of take a step back and make sure they're not sticking, because while, say, the outsides are pretty well floured, you might have, say, some stickiness just on the sides where you can see along here. And you don't want those sticking together, because this is something that can be a big issue if you're, say, doing something in a pot, like if I were going to completely boil these, is one would stick to another, and then that's lumpier, and then that lump gets stuck to like a third one, and it just becomes this mishmash web of noodles, and that's not what you want. So, in fact, I'm actually going to take probably about half of these for our stroganoff recipe in the next show and just cut them lengthwise for that. And this is specifically because I'm going to be stirring, and if you have sticky noodles, that stirring is just a bad thing, because that's exactly what's going to spawn that web. Give it one more light little dusting. If you need to, if it is sticky, what I've done when that came up is I would just make them a little bit tinier, toss them in a bowl, and you literally just kind of like toss the bowl up and down. All right? Also, at this point, this is where if your dough itself is a little bit too strong, like it's pulling together, I would then just go do another pass once they're pretty small. It's way easier to get them stretched out. But I'm just going to lay these on the side. I usually would just put them in the fridge for, say, 5 to 10 minutes while I prep whatever else I'm going to make. Or like I said, you can freeze it, and then you could just pull them out when you're ready. It is important to let them either dry out or kind of chill a little bit in either the freezer or the fridge, because it just makes them behave more like what you would expect for a store-bought noodle, which is essentially it has had all the water pulled out of it, and then they will work with any recipe you would buy those for. I also think this would be kind of a fun recipe where once you make your own, I think you would probably never make your own with the same way twice. I think it'd be a big deal to say, okay, that was cool, but can I add something to the noodle itself? Again, this is just an idea that kind of spawned off the fact that I like thick noodles. Like if you're going for a very fine pasta, you wouldn't, but like, oh, I bet there's more stuff I could put in. Like if I have, say, a very aromatic dish I want this in, why not put it straight into the noodle and then see how that comes out? But these are our noodles. These would be easy enough where in the next show we're just going to toss them into a pot with a bunch of ground beef and spices, and they're going to absorb the rich sauce. Again, I can't stress, like, just really you want to dial this in and make it your way. I was so surprised that I loved like these thick cut noodles, because it looks like they're just kind of stumpy, but it made a huge difference for me. But I think it's important that it's not nearly as hard to make, and it actually really makes you so much more invested in your dish when you make your own noodles. So I'm Grant. This is a great recipe where you could easily make it months ahead of time, so you can reuse the ingredients. It's got pretty much anything you would have in your kitchen normally. Like, I don't think I had to go out and buy anything to prep this recipe. It's just eggs, flour, salt, olive oil. You can sub in milk if you want that. You can add butter if you want it to be creamier. It's just a very flexible, awesome little recipe that really makes it a personalized dish.